Recently, I debunked the doomsday claims of a Jehovah's Witness who made an appearance on the Atheist Experience, but it's a really convoluted prophecy. Why do Jehovah's Witnesses view 1914 as a significant year? How'd they get there? What's the story? I brought in a couple of experts in ancient Babylonian history from the YouTube channel Digital Hammurabi to help us wade through the information. Let's get into it. I have here Digital Hammurabi. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Megan. This is Josh. We run the Digital Hammurabi YouTube channel. It's primarily concerned with providing educational resources about the ancient Near East, including the Bible, the context in which the Bible was written, and information about an area called Mesopotamia, which is mostly modern day Iraq. So we have language classes, we have literary readings, we have academic interviews, all kinds of stuff for people who are just generally interested in ancient history.
Some people coming here may wonder, why do I have you guys here? Well, that's because you guys study an area of the world that is very unique and required for Jehovah's Witness theology to work. So I figured that I would get into the theology, explain why they require that to work, and then you guys can help me out figure out why they're completely wrong. Let's start with the prophecy. How'd they arrive at the date 1914? Why is it significant in the first place? Let me just lay out the beliefs. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus came back to earth invisibly in 1914, which signaled the beginning of the last days. He then proceeded to wander around the earth examining the world's religions until he finally chose the religion known as the Bible Students in 1919, run by Charles Taze Russell. Eventually, the Bible Students experienced what can only be described as a hostile takeover by somebody named Joseph Rutherford, and after he installed himself as president and consolidated his power, he renamed the organization to Jehovah's Witnesses. But the Bible Students still exist, so if anybody was chosen by Jesus as God's true faith, it wasn't Jehovah's Witnesses. Either way, it all falls apart if 1914 isn't the correct date. It all hinges on that. So is it? How'd they get to 1914? Let's start from the beginning. The 1800s in America was a booming time for religion. Mormonism got its start in the 1820s, 1830s, and started to explode. You had the Millerite movement, which was renowned for making end-of-the-world predictions. And from the Millerite movement, you got Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, Baha'i, and lots of other splinters. So what made the Millerites stand out from other Christian denominations? Their doomsday math. They had this whole calculation they used to predict the end of the world. They came up with a date, 1843. And when nothing happened, guess what? They changed the date to 1844. They claimed they forgot there's no year zero. It goes from 1 BCE to 1 CE. So they added an extra year to the calculations to account for that, which put them at 1844. They put everything into it. Their members sold all their stuff and donated it to the church. They were all waiting for the rapture. And when nothing happened, again, the date went down in history as the Great Disappointment. There were riots. Churches were burned. It ruined lives. After that, the Millerites split into three factions. The group that believed the Bible math was right but thought they had the wrong starting point, which would change the end date. The group that believed they did have the right date, it just wasn't the date for the rapture, it was the date when Jesus came back to earth invisibly. And finally, the group that thought the Bible math was all BS. The founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Taze Russell, and the founder of Seventh-day Adventists, Ellen G. White, went to the same Millerite church at one point. They split into factions just like everybody else. Eventually, Charles Taze Russell had ideas for the math. He was infatuated with the whole doomsday prediction thing, so he tried working the math and making predictions of his own. He originally claimed the last days began in 1799, and 1874 was the start of Jesus' invisible presence on Earth. He continued to change it through the years, but he made lots and lots of predictions pre-1914. Eventually, he settled on a specific date, 1913, and guess what happened? Absolutely nothing. Again. Oh, stupid. Forgot there's no year zero. What a silly goose. Have to push it forward to 1914. Huh. Kind of odd that the Millerites, the group that invented this math in the first place, did the exact same thing. Forgot there's no year zero, so pushed it forward a year. Well, we have it right this time, don't we? So something's definitely going to happen. Nope. It fell flat. just like every other prediction. So this time, instead of saying he got the math wrong again, he said Jesus came to Earth invisibly, and it's the beginning of the end. So how the hell did they get to 1914 in the first place? What's this fabled Bible math? It's all based off of a verse in the book of Daniel. It's kind of a convoluted trip, so stick with me while we wade through it. We'll start by reading the verse that they use in the book of Daniel. It's Daniel chapter 4. To set the theme, Nebuchadnezzar had a confusing dream, and he wanted Daniel to interpret it for him. So he goes on to describe the dream to him in Daniel 4:10-16. I'll read part of it. It says, "In the visions of my head while on my bed, I saw a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was enormous. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached the heavens, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth." A couple verses down, it goes on to say, "I saw a holy one coming down from the heavens. He called out loudly, 'Chop down the tree, cut off its branches, shake off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from beneath it, and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump with its roots in the ground, with a binding of iron and copper, among the grass of the field. Let its heart be changed from that of a human, and let it be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over it." So Daniel goes on to interpret the dream. He tells him that the tree represents him, Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 25 he says, "You will be driven away from among men, and your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field, and you'll be given vegetation to eat, just like bulls. And 7 times will pass over you, until you know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that he grants it to whomever he wants." Boom, there you go. Daniel makes a prediction, and according to the book, that prophecy is fulfilled. Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that the dream he had means he's going to wander around like a beast of the field for 7 times. And according to the book, he did. The end. Except it's not really the end. The Millerites thought there was some extra special meaning to this verse that the Bible doesn't even hint at. They thought it was prophesying the end of the world. Where'd they get that idea? I have absolutely no clue. It doesn't even imply there's any meaning beyond what Daniel explains to Nebuchadnezzar. It was completely fabricated by the Millerites in the 1800s. So that's where the math starts, from those verses. It says that Nebuchadnezzar will roam the field like a wild beast for 7 times. This begs the question, what is a time? Some people assumed it was a year, some assumed it was a season, some assumed it was a day. There's only one reference to a time in the Bible that has a specific time frame attached to it, and that's in the book of Revelation. Revelation 12:6 refers to 3.5 times as 1,260 days. It says, "And the woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. If you do the math on that, it basically means one time is roughly 1 year. 1,260 divided by 3.5 is 360. And of course, according to our calendar, there are 365 days in a year. Close enough, right? And according to the book of Daniel, that's how long Nebuchadnezzar wandered the fields like a wild animal. 7 years, 7 times. So according to this math, if 1,260 days is 3.5 times, then 7 times should be 2,520 days. So now we have the numbers, but the Millerites had a little more work to do on it. They believed that we weren't working with days. They believed it was 2,520 years, not days. So they scoured the Bible for a verse that would support it. And they found one. In the book of Numbers, chapter 14, verse 33, it says, "And your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years, and bear your whoredoms, until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness. After the number of the days in which you search the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall you bear your iniquities, even 40 years. So there you go. A Bible verse that says a day for a year. It's completely out of context. It has nothing to do with anything else. It doesn't relate to this prophecy the Millerites fabricated in any way, but there it says it, a day for a year. And it's in the Bible, so you know it's true. That's all they needed. Now they took those 2,520 days and converted it to years. So now they have 2,520 years. All they need is a starting point to start counting. As I said, the Millerites' original starting point brought them to 1843. Then they realized they forgot there wasn't a year zero, so they adjusted it to 1844. After the split, Charles Taze Russell decided to pick a different starting point. He chose the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon. At the time, we believed it happened in 606 BCE. If you add 2,520 years to 606 BCE, you arrive at 1914. So that's the convoluted, confusing, weird story of how Jehovah's Witnesses arrived at 1914. It's Bible math built on top of assumptions, on top of fabrications, on top of prophecy that they completely made up. And it involves pulling verses from a billion different places in the Bible and cramming them together together as though they should be read side by side, even though they were written in completely different times and contexts. Honestly, that's all we have to say about it right there. It's absurd at its face. Even if the math added up correctly, it should be obvious how ridiculous it is. Except, the math doesn't even add up correctly. Yes, it's true. At the time, we thought Jerusalem fell to Babylon in 606 BCE. But come to find out, that date is inaccurate. And we know that without a shadow of a doubt. It was 586, 20 years later. I can hear you asking, how can we be so sure of that? It happened millennia ago. That's why I brought on Digital Hammurabi. They can explain how we can be so sure that it was 586, not 606. How do we know that Jerusalem didn't fall to the Babylonians in 607? How do we know that it was 587 and not 607?
So chronology generally for the ancient world can be quite thorny. But we're really lucky with Mesopotamia in that we have several very important astronomical texts.
We have the best words.
We do have the best words. But there are several different astronomical diaries where people just sat down and wrote out for like days and days and days what they could see in the sky. So you have records of eclipses, you have records of the position of the stars, the position of the planets, the phases of the moon. And these are specific enough that you can actually track where in the Julian calendar these dates are. So there's a series, there's a tablet that records the movements of the Venus star, for example. And that particular series of movements only comes around like once every several thousand years. So we know with actually very good accuracy exactly when we're looking at. So these astronomical diaries often contain also the years of the specific king they were written in.
One of the things that's really nice about the tablets that we work, or the text that we work with, is that we have the originals. If you study the biblical text, you're working with copies of copies of copies. But we don't have any original manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible or of the Greek New Testament, whatever. We have the cuneiform clay tablets, right? The originals. You can see people's fingerprints in them. So that's a huge bonus for us that they're still extant. But on top of that, many of the very mundane, sort of boring texts like
sales receipts, tax documentation,
contracts,
letters,
they will have such and such a day of such and such month, the year, the third year of Shulgi the king, or the year that Shulgi built such and such boat. So the reason that they put that in there is specifically for the same reason that we would put it in, to mark the particular date. And we have these compilation tablets where they go through and they list out the year names in order.
If you have the year Shulgi built this particular boat, you can then go to this compilation tablet and say, oh, look, Shulgi built that boat in the third year of his reign, and we know that that is X year BCE.
So if you can, we're simplifying it obviously to a certain degree, but there are people that spend their entire careers doing dating. But if you can pinpoint this event took place in this year of this king, a lot of times that then allows you to, with a large sweep, identify the sequence of years, regnal years. You could be fairly precise in that sense.
Generally speaking, this technique, the dating, gets more precise the further into history, the further forward in history you get. So the very, very early stuff, you can say, oh, well, it was in this century, maybe this 50-year block. As you get later and later and later, and we get more information and the dating systems become more accurate, and people start being taking more notice of the world around them. So these astronomical diaries that I'm talking about, they're relatively late. You can get more and more precise. So you can get within a year, within a couple of months, sometimes to an exact day, which is fantastic for historians. And the Neo-Babylonian period, the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, that falls within this area of
where
great
it's really,
specificity.
really detailed, and we have pretty specific days or dates at the very least. Very interesting. So you were talking about how we have cuneiform tablets. Is that right? What is that? Can you explain that?
So cuneiform is they're essentially wedge shapes that were impressed onto clay tablets using a reed stylus, and they look like little triangles. My mum calls them fish. They look like fish butting into straight lines. Normally, I think they're awesome.
I've never heard that. But,
yeah.
Okay.
They're also referred to as chicken scratch by students who are learning to read cuneiform for the first time, because it sometimes just looks like a chicken walked across a piece of clay and you're being asked to translate it. But it's a fantastic writing system. It was in use for like 4,000 years.
Your audience can go to our channel.
Yeah, definitely. I'll put a link in the description so they can check it out.
But we do have, like introductory stuff. But there are all kinds of Assyriologists that do this. Irving Finkel does it. But basically, what they would do is they would, pat some clay, get some clay, and they would take a reed and they would sharpen it down, and so there's a point to it, and then you could impress that into the clay. And when you did that, it created these
wedges,
series of wedges. And if you organize the wedges in a certain way, some of them horizontal, some of them vertical, whatever,
I see.
They meant different syllables.
Okay, so it's similar to Chinese then, it sounds a little bit, where Chinese is organized into syllables, not really letters.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I'm right in saying Chinese also has logograms.
You got me. That's literally the extent of my knowledge of Chinese. Yeah.
But so, cuneiform. And it was used to write several different languages, but you have both syllabic writings and some signs that stand for entire words. So it can be a lot of fun to translate and very, very frustrating.
So you guys can translate it yourselves then, I guess. That's amazing, man. I swear, that is so cool. Like, how long did it take you guys to like learn that whole thing? Like probably your whole careers, right?
It's an ongoing experience.
So the two primary languages that we studied are Sumerian and Akkadian. I focused more on Sumerian in my PhD. She focused more on Akkadian, although we can both read both. But it definitely takes time. And the interesting thing about it is there are certain genres that are relatively straightforward, comparatively speaking, like economic texts or legal contracts. They're very formalized.
Right.
But we tended to focus on literary texts, like liturgical texts, which
means you have to deal with things like metaphor, which is never easy in a foreign language,
right.
Even less easy in a
old
dead language.
Yeah. You were talking about genres and things, like different types of texts and what they were all about and things like that. What was the Book of Daniel? What was it about? Was it like a historical text, or what's the deal with that? Because there are a lot of really weird things in it.
Yeah. One of the problems that people face, particularly in the 21st century, when we look back at ancient texts, is we think we have certain types of texts that we read, and if we look back in ancient texts and they look sort of similar, then we think, oh, that must be the same. So if we were to open up a book and it started with "Once upon a time," immediately as readers we would know this is a fairy tale, and everything would be colored in our minds. We would interpret that text in a very different way than, say, "Welcome to
Biology 101."
Biology 101, right? Or "Thank you for purchasing the Clark-O-Matic 5000," right? When we read those things, immediately we place the text that comes after that in a category, right? The second one, we know this is a textbook that we're probably reading at a university. The third one, this is a manual. The problem is that because we read these texts on a regular basis, we can categorize them that way, and there are little clues.
We have context for that stuff.
That's exactly right. The problem is that sometimes when we go back to, let's say, books of the Bible, there are books in the Bible that look for all the world like what we would consider to be history writing. And so what we do is we wholesale say, okay, well, if 1 Samuel is writing and it looks like history, well, God, we just need to read it like that. And if Genesis 1 looks like history, well, we just got to read it that way. And so that's where you come up with all these problems, like, okay, so this is actually how God did creation. Okay.
And sorry, I'd add to that there are genres that appear in ancient texts that we just don't have anymore.
That's exactly right.
Like, we don't really compose mythology anymore. All the mythology we have is old. So when you get to something that looks like history but is actually mythology, it's very difficult to recognize it for the myth that it is rather than the history we'd like it to be.
And I think that it's problematic for those of you that don't know, I'm an agnostic. Megan is a Christian.
Oh, I did not know that. You're a Christian. Okay,
I am.
fascinating. Okay.
But none of this poses any problem for Megan, right? But a lot of people have a problem with seeing the Bible in that way, because we come to it and we say, okay, well, either Genesis 1 is true. It's either true that on the first day God created this, and then the second day he created this. It's either true or false that Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden fruit and that brought sin. That's either true or it's false. And what's interesting to me, what I like to talk about when people say that sort of thing to me is, and I always forget the psalm every time. I've said this 1,000 times, but I always forget what psalm it was. But David says day and night, he's really sad. He's been mourning. And he says, day and night, my tears have been my food. And I say to them, is that true or false? And people look at me with a sort of a quizzical look, and they say, what do you mean? Is that true or false? That's a weird question to ask. That's
right.
Poetry. Exactly. You see, you understand that asking, is it true or false, is a weird question of the genre of poetry. Now, what you can say is, what is it that David is trying to say? What is he doing with that text? Well, he's trying to relay to you, using this type of poetic form, that he was very, very sad. And that is true, right? So if you go to Genesis 1 and you see Yahweh doing this and doing this and doing that, and you say, what is it that the text is doing? And you answer the question, well, the text is showing that not Baal and not Marduk, not Ashur, it's Yahweh that created the world. That is true, right? From the standpoint of the person.
I understand.
So understanding the genre of text is absolutely critical. So you asked me about Daniel, and I've gone all the way around the world. When we come to Daniel is a particular genre of text, particularly the portions that are highly debated. And that's, chapters 7 through 12 with the visions, the revelations. This is apocalyptic genre. And it does a lot of different things, and we see a lot of different apocalyptic genre in the Second Temple period, in this period, and of course later. But the one thing that apocalyptic genre does pretty consistently is that it gives hope and encouragement and calls for the steadfastness and faithfulness of the people that are hearing that message. The big debate, of course, that happens a lot with Daniel is, when was it composed? And the reason that that's such a debated topic, it's not debated among scholars. Like most scholars, it's 2nd century. That's it. Like that's the majority scholarship position. The only reason that this becomes contentious, for the most part anyway, people are looking at this text as a divinely inspired text that is predicting the future. So if you read through the book of Daniel, particularly 7 through 12, you see that the author Daniel, who's supposed to be writing in the 6th century, 5th century, during that time frame, he's predicting the coming of these kingdoms that end with Greece, end with Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. From that standpoint that says, oh, this must be a prophetic text that is genuinely predicting the future, then you have to date this thing early before all these events take place. The problem is that if you read the rest of apocalyptic genre, and this is not me speaking here, if your audience was to read some really good writing about this, John J. Collins has a pretty recent book, 2016 maybe, but he talks about apocalyptic. He's sort of the
authority on it, I guess.
He really is. And he's been writing about it for decades. And
about apocalyptic genre, basically, right?
That's correct. That's correct. He has a very hefty commentary on the book of Daniel. It's excellent. But the purpose of Daniel is, it's written during the 2nd century BCE. It was compiled during that period. So these visions, almost all of them end right with Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, during the persecution that was taking place against the Jews. This text is essentially saying to its audience, who are being sorely tempted to leave Orthodox Judaism and to go and become Hellenized, right? To go and follow the Greek ways, because that's that's what keeps them from being killed. It's to say, no, stand fast, stand firm, because all this stuff was predicted in the past. See, this is all God's plan. Everything that you see leading up to right now is God's plan. And in fact, when you get to chapter 11 of the book of Daniel, you see that there's a certain point where he gets all the history right, all of it, like boom, 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 boom. It's all really spot on and pretty detailed. And then it kind of goes awry. And it's the part where it predicts, it's an actual prediction by the writer who's saying, Antiochus is going to be, these are the things that are going to happen to Antiochus the Fourth, and then God is going to come back and establish his kingdom and all these things. Of course, that doesn't happen. But that genre is utilized specifically for that reason, to keep people faithful in the midst often of a very severe persecution.
I know that your expertise is kind of in that specific type of time frame. What do you know about like the Book of Revelation, or what are your thoughts on it, just from like, the perspective of somebody who's studied apocalyptic genre in the first place?
So, as a caveat, I'm not a New Testament scholar.
Right.
Just maybe to give brief background to my education, just so everybody knows.
Right.
I have a bachelor's degree in religion. I have a master's in theology, where I took 6 years of Koine Greek, and I took a whole bunch of Semitic languages, so Akkadian, Hebrew, Aramaic. Studied some Ugaritic, studied a little Syriac. But my master's in theology was in Old Testament studies. Then I went to Hopkins and got another master's in ancient Near Eastern studies, and then a PhD in Assyriology with a minor in Hebrew Bible. So I can work with the New Testament, I think, at a pretty reasonable level, but I don't have a PhD in New Testament
Right, so
studies,
it's just you talking, not
that's right.
Not
that's
an
right.
education talking. Gotcha.
Now, that being said, one of the things that's neat about having a PhD is that you can kind of sift through the scholarly literature in an efficient and effective way. So, the Book of Revelation, it borrows pretty heavily from Daniel and from other, apocalyptic genre. And of course, it is an apocalyptic text. And if you think about what the writings in the New Testament, much of the New Testament are doing, you think about one of the things that Peter says, for example, is I think it's in 2 Peter 3, if I'm remembering that correctly. And he talks about how so many people are saying that are leaving the faith, oh, look, the promises that God made aren't coming to pass, so it must not be true. And Peter's saying, don't be fooled. The reason these things aren't coming to pass is because God is being patient, right? So he's giving a justification, just like we've been talking about all along with these, predictive prophecies things, giving a justification for why it hasn't happened. He's saying God's being patient. He should have struck them all down, but you know what? God is so loving that he's waiting. But don't you give up. Don't you lose faith. Don't you become, an apostate. You stick with it.
That's like the goal of that apocalyptic writing, was to try to encourage people and keep them going. And is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, you think about the churches that are addressed in the early chapters of Revelation. So many of them have they're praised for holding on to the faith, just like like in the book of Hebrews, for example, or they're taught. They're I can't think of the word. Rebuked is the word I'm thinking of, for falling into this, or starting to go toward this apostate, becoming lukewarm, those sorts of things. So yeah, it's a stand fast. It's God's gonna come to the rescue. It's gonna happen. It's been predicted. It's all been prophesied. It's all been laid out, which is one of the reasons that type of text, again, it's ambiguous enough to be applied broadly, but it has enough specific notions so that details that people can find ways to
They're
work
like modern
it.
day astrological horoscopes.
That's a really good comparison.
Thank you.
Yes, that's exactly right.
We have hit our time. I really appreciate you guys coming on and talking to me about this. It's been very, very fascinating. Just before we get off of here, where can people find you? You guys have Digital Hammurabi is your YouTube channel, right? Is there anything else that you want to talk about?
So we have the YouTube channel. We have a website, which is just digitalhammurabi.com. And that has more information about Josh and myself, some of our research, a calendar for our live streams. It also has information about our summer scholarship program. We crowdfund I think we managed to make enough money to support 3 PhD students this summer. So everyone who donates to the Patreon or sends us money via PayPal gets to vote on what research they'd like to fund with their money.
But we were able to give 3 different
we've got
PhD students $2,000 a piece.
That is amazing.
Pay them $2,000
really cool.
to go do the research.
The issue with summer funding is that there isn't any for PhD students. You
Yeah.
get often paid during the school year, and then there's nothing. So if you want to carry out research, if you want to keep working, you have to apply for grants, which are few and far between, or get paid work, which is fine, but it means that you then don't have any time to do your schoolwork.
Right.
So then you're in school longer, which costs more money.
Yeah. Well, I'm really, really glad to hear you guys are working on that. So they can check you out at your website. More information on that there, I assume.
Yeah.
And also
We
the
have
YouTube
a
channel.
Twitter feed, right?
Yeah, we have Twitter, which is @Digi_Hammurabi. That's mostly me. But if you see anyone arguing with Christian apologetics, then that's Josh.
Did I say that right? Feed? A Twitter feed?
Twitter timeline?
Yeah.
Twitter timeline?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's probably not what I meant, but
None of us here know anything about social media. I understand. I'm in the same boat. So anyway, I'll put all the links to that in the description. If anybody wants to check it out, then do that. And again, I appreciate you guys coming on and talking to me. It's been fascinating, and I will talk to you guys again, okay?
thank you.
If you like what I do and you want to make sure I can continue to do it, you can support me in a few ways. First, you can support me on Patreon. That's probably the best way. But if you want to get something back for your support, you can check out my Teespring. I'm trying to make a shirt design for every cult I've covered. I haven't gotten every one, but I'm working on it. So check it out and see if your cult is up there. Second, you can support me by checking out my game shop. I sell controller, cartridge, and game box stands for every system from the original Nintendo and Sega Game Gear to the Xbox One and Nintendo Switch. So give that a look too. And finally, if you want to support me in some way other than monetarily, you can check out my other YouTube channels. I have a retro game channel where I answer questions like, why does Shy Guy have a mask? And why are CRT TVs the best way to play retro games? I also have the podcast where I talk about stuff I don't feel I can say on a monetized channel. And finally, I have my main channel where I talk about cults. I wish I didn't have to worry about dancing around subjects carefully in the first place, but I chose to do this as a full-time job, so unfortunately I rely on YouTube's AdSense and on the support of patrons to continue doing the work I do. Anyways, check me out in all those places if you haven't already. Thanks for listening, guys.